Thanks for downloading the RealAg Radio podcast. If you enjoyed this program, 1, tell your friends, and 2, we got another show that you'll be interested in. It's called RealAg on the Weekends. It goes out every Saturday. It's broadcast across Saskatchewan on RealAg Radio on 650 CKOM and 980 CGME, as well as we podcast it as well. It's really a look at the week that was in Canadian agriculture. Make sure you check it out. It's called RealAg on the Weekend. Enjoy today's episode of RealAg Radio.
This episode of RealAg Radio is brought to you by high-performing new carbine insecticide from FMC. Carbine insecticide delivers fast, selective, and extended control of aphids in alfalfa and pulses, leaving beneficials like lady beetles to help in the fight. Ask your retailer today.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Hello and welcome to this Wednesday, April 26th edition of RealAg Radio here on Sirius XM. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and I am super excited about today's show. Do I ever say that I'm not excited? Let's be honest. I really enjoy hosting the show. This has been already so much fun. I get to do it again tomorrow. Sean is having a wonderful time down in the States. I think he's in Nashville right now. So if you see him, if you're out and about, make sure you say hello and let him know that I'm doing an excellent job hosting the show. Let's be honest, he's probably listening to it. Anyway, today's show, really good one. So Wednesdays, we typically try and stick to the markets. So at least 1 or 2 interviews that are going to touch on the markets. I decided today, well, and there's a good reason for it, but one of the things we're going to do, we're going to talk energy markets. So diesel, natural gas, energy supply and demand in general. But of course, we cannot have an energy discussion without talking, of course, global geopolitics. So to do that, I've invited Phil Flynn. He is author of the Energy Report. So I've got him lined up on the show. We're going to hear whether or not you should be locking in those diesel prices. I know that certainly spring is a huge fuel demand time, but we are making decisions all the way through the fall right now. And so, yes, stick around for that. He'll be here, I think, in the 4th segment. So near the end of the show, we'll have Phil on. We cannot, of course, have a discussion today on the grain markets without talking about StatsCan. So the StatsCan report came out around, 8:30-ish this morning. So I decided what a wonderful time to chat with Jon Driedger of Leftfield Commodity Research. So we're going to get his take on the StatsCan report. There are a few caveats around this one. So the findings are out there. We're going to break it all down with Jon. But one of the key things we're going to touch on is that survey that StatsCan is sharing now was actually done in like December, January, which is a bit different than usual. That's quite some time out from, the decisions farmers might be making right now based on conditions. So we definitely are going to dig into a little bit of that. I've got a product spotlight with US Borax coming up as well. And then as promised, I am going to touch on some of the news at the tail end of the show. Rob Miller and Bernard Tobin are going to join us for a quick discussion on weed control in the soybean crop, especially because for most of Ontario, we had a very mild, short-lived winter, and we've got some significant weed issues that are sort of rearing their ugly head because we didn't get the winter kill or the prolonged cold conditions that we're sort of used to. So this is your alert, everyone. If you are in Ontario or, of course, just south of there in the U.S., if you haven't been walking those fields, now is the time to do it because we've certainly got some issues popping up, if you will, in some of those fields. So stick around. That's the end of the show. As always, would love your feedback. I have been getting a couple messages, a couple DMs, letting people know what I flubbed up on, that I say too much. I get it. I know. I'm not as practiced at this as Sean, but I'm trying, and practice makes progress. That's how it goes. So thank you so much for all your feedback. If you would like to let me know about feedback on the show, somebody you'd like to hear from, whatever it may be, zip me a message on the RealAg feedback line. That's 1-855-776-6147. Or, of course, you can find us across social media at Real Agriculture, or use that hashtag RealAg Radio, and we'll find you as well. All right, without further ado, let's get to the show right after this.
Looking to launch a successful career in agri-sales or take yours to the next level? Lakeland College's Agri-Sales and Customer Relations Certificate takes you beyond the classroom to learn from the experts. This apprenticeship-style program will teach you everything you need to know to thrive in a sales career. The real world doesn't wait. Register for Agri-Sales and Customer Relations today at lakelandcollege.ca.
Peter Johnson at Wheat Pete, RealAgriculture.com, and what an opportunity! Oh my gosh! You think you can't grow better wheat? You are absolutely wrong. We're going to show you how to strive for those record wheat yields that they get in the UK and in New Zealand. You can grow 150 bushel wheat. I'll show you how.
Catch Wheat Pete's Word every Wednesday on RealAgriculture.com or download the podcast on iTunes or Spotify.
How's your seed quality? What should you treat with? What about herbicide carryover and environmental concerns? Spring is here, and you've got a lot of things to think about in regards to your pulse crop. The Pulse School on Real Agriculture has information and advice for all these questions and more to help you navigate this season. Brought to you by BASF. Pulse School episodes are available at pulseschool.com, realagriculture.com, or as a podcast on your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. I am your host today, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is brought to you by MNP, your trusted business partners and leading ag business advisory firm in Canada. Proudly serving clients from coast to coast. Take your operations business planning to the next level and visit us today at mmp.ca. Jon Driedger, Leftfield Commodity Research, coming to you out of Manitoba. Jon, we had a StatsCan report this morning. What do we think? There's some asterisks around this one.
Yeah, there are some asterisks around this report, but I guess I would probably say overall the numbers were maybe not too far out of line with what the trade was thinking. And as always, when you come into a report like this, there's a range of estimates. So for example, something like say spring wheat was a little higher than people were thinking, but people were anticipating the number would be higher than last year, and that was the case. Certainly, something like canola, range of estimates a little higher than last year, maybe not as much as some were thinking, but directionally not dramatically different than maybe what folks are thinking overall in terms of just coming in. So in that sense, not overly shocking per se, I think, for a lot of the numbers. As always, maybe you do a little handicapping per se, but I think as you mentioned at the outset here, Lyndsey, there's maybe a few more questions around this one than might ordinarily be the case when we look at this April report.
Right. So we're digging into it. This is, of course, farmers answered what they intend to plant, what the crop plan is. But when we dig into when the question was asked, it was December, January, which our minds can change a lot based on what the season looks like. So how do we factor that into where some of these numbers might actually fall?
Yeah, that's of course a really good question, and I mean a little bit of context. One of the initiatives that StatsCan is trying to do is to make their surveys less burdensome on farmers, and I think that's a noble intention, but maybe with one of the fallouts of some of that is does that potentially impact maybe the quality of some of the data, right. And so always with the April intentions report, typically that survey would be done kind of late March, maybe into early April. There might still be some late season swings because of weather or those sorts of things, but typically, it's not going to change dramatically. But of course, as you mentioned, Lyndsey, we look in the middle of December into early January, and quite a bit can change between then and when farmers make their final decisions. For example, I think for most provinces, crop insurance coverage only comes out after those dates, and to the extent that shifts seeding planting intentions, maybe makes a bit of a difference. Now, on the one hand, I mean, we're a little careful. I think when we think about some of the trends that were shifting our own internal forecasts, I think a lot of them were already kind of in place or trending in that direction already by midwinter. So we want to be a little careful to not I guess, too heavily discount the numbers that came out today because it was earlier. But certainly, you back the clock up a few months during a time when farmers are still making decisions, and it lends itself to a bigger revision in June than we might typically see.
Right. And so I guess that's really where, we see this going, of course, is that we should see in June, we'll sort of get that correction, if you will, if there is a major one on any of them. Now, if I think about, conditions from January to now, or January to end of March, the prairies have kind of got smacked with some prolonged cold weather. Lots of snow, though, and snow in some areas is good, even if it is in the wrong form of precipitation. So do you see, the impact of this cool spring potentially swinging one of those crop acres more than the other?
Well, I would think of it this way, Lyndsey, that it's maybe still a bit early to force major swings, in our opinion. But certainly, every week the calendar flips over and there's not a lot of progress made. You kind of start really getting a squeeze and a crunch, and the risk of that increases. So I guess our approach has been that we're not quite there yet. And I think even, for example, in the Eastern Prairies last year, I mean, quite frankly, I think the spring was a little worse and the situation was even more dire, and the acres got in. And I don't know that we saw maybe massive swings in final acres from what initially was expected. But of course, that was real dicey for a while. Yeah. I don't know that we're trending in that direction. So I guess all that's to say that when we think about acres specifically, first of all, there's some questions about the timing of the survey. And now you layer on, what is kind of a late spring. Again, not inevitably baked in the cards, big changes, but certainly something we're watching closely if things don't improve here pretty soon.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, that Red River Valley does look like they'll be flooding again this year, perhaps not trending as bad as last year. And so I do bring up the moisture question because there are certainly areas, Saskatchewan, Alberta, let's say, that maybe did get some snow cover this year that they desperately needed. But are you hearing, is it enough to really change our production outlook, or is it really just enough to keep everyone a little hopeful?
Yeah, typically our approach, and you're right, we had a good chunk of Western Canada here that has been dry, and so they'll appreciate the moisture, even if they'd maybe rather have it in a different form. Typically, I guess how we view it as we come into a season like this, we tend to lean towards, call it an average-ish type of yield, until we have a good reason to kind of start, ratcheting it higher or lower. So in that sense, I guess we weren't kind of, working our production figures down too much because of the early season dryness. Rather, it's like, okay, we got to really watch this. It is one of those where it's, you come into spring and all of a sudden you have a couple good rains and everyone forgets about those dryness maps that we were looking at in March and April. And so we're a little careful to not jump the gun. So in that sense, we haven't necessarily increased our production estimates a whole lot because of this moisture per se. But certainly, if we can ease some of that risk and some of that concern, that's good for farmers. Again, it doesn't change our numbers, but certainly it's maybe starts to somewhat reduce one of the risks that we've been keeping a real close eye on now.
Mm-hmm. Now, I am reminded because, of course, this week when I told everyone I was hosting RealAg Radio this week and I said we were going to do markets, I get a lot of, well, corn is king, so just talk about corn. So I have to, of course, we have to mention corn. And specifically, I do hear a lot of discussions. Corn prices have, are elevated. Are we looking at corrections there? I think just before we hit record, you used the term malaise in some of the markets. Is corn one of those ones that is suffering from that or no?
Yeah, and I think with a lot of these markets, I use the phrase malaise as we were chatting before because I think we just see a lot of these markets just kind of grinding lower and kind of as we mentioned, earlier prior to getting on the call, there's all sorts of reasons why markets could spike higher. We know that most of these markets are tight coming into this next harvest. The situation in Ukraine is uncertain. We have all these areas where we're watching weather and yield risks. And all those things are very real and could very well, pop markets higher. And yet we see markets kind of grinding sideways to lower in a lot of cases, which, is obviously kind of markets just kind of shrugging it off, whether the market is being too complacent or whether it's, an element of prove it. That's certainly the action that we're seeing. But I think in terms of corn specifically, honestly, I think the corn market is absolutely fascinating in the sense that, if the acres get in as intended, and if we get the sorts of yields that are tossed around maybe by USDA, and I think the ag outlook for them, most would view as being a little overly ambitious, but if those sorts of things line up, we are going to have a big build in the carryout, and lower prices absolutely are justified, probably a fair bit lower than what we're looking at today. At the same time, it doesn't take a whole lot of tweaks to either acres or yield, and suddenly we get back to a carryout that's maybe closer to what we saw this last year, and corn prices were trading, well above, $1 a bushel above, say, where the December futures are today. So it really doesn't take a big miss on the production side to cause a big swing in that carryout, and obviously that directly impacts prices. So, a big range of possible outcomes in corn. Somewhere along the line, you look at the range of outcomes in December is almost kind of sitting right in the middle of some different price scenarios, kind of straddling the fence. Maybe that's a fair way of looking at where we're at today. You look at the spring, and certainly you could say that there's probably some acres that are at risk in the northern U.S., and you start maybe trimming off some acres. If you shave a bit of yield, we do get tight. But again, maybe it's a little early to just assume that quite yet, and maybe that's a little bit what the market's reflecting so far.
Yeah, it does. It certainly does feel a little early, though. Certainly listening to reports this week, the winter wheat crop in the U.S. has been downgraded again. If that's an indication, maybe they've got cool conditions as well. So we've certainly got the dry areas still dealing with in the U.S. So still lots to be figured out in the next, 2 to 4 weeks as to what goes in the ground and what the outlook might be.
Yeah, no, certainly. I think in a few weeks from now, we'll definitely have a better sense. Here in Western Canada, are we getting some wheels turning? What do the conditions look like? In the U.S., of course, what's the planting progress looking like? You maybe start getting a little bit closer to where those longer range forecasts aren't quite as long range, maybe a little more confidence in them, and you kind of maybe start at least somewhat narrowing in the range of possible outcomes on the production side. And obviously that has a huge impact on what the longer term outlook is from a price perspective. So, a few weeks, I think we'll know a lot more, lots of question marks where we're at today. And I think, as we said, talked about at the outset, it's, lots of risks out there, but they're not inevitable and not absolutely baked in the cards yet. So obviously watch points, but we also don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves and assume markets are going to go higher because we got problems here, and here. We got things to watch here, and here, but they're not inevitable yet. And that's how we've been approaching this.
Now, let's talk canola for just a minute. We could talk canola and soybeans, of course. We'll call them sisters. We're still hearing, we just had, I think was it Louis Dreyfus that just came out and said that they're expanding crush at Yorkton. So there still seems to be decent momentum on the crush side for Western Canada. Are you hearing that from farmers as being a positive? Are people hopeful this is all coming online? How is that working into decisions they're making now?
Yeah, I think because a lot of these plants, they sort of come online down the road. I don't know that it's impacting, say, short-term decisions a whole lot for farmers here in Western Canada. But I would say just in general, I think it's a great thing. At the end of the day, the more canola that gets processed in your backyard, the less that has to, be subject to, say, rail movement to Vancouver, or if we have a trade dispute with China or those sorts of things again, the less reliance on export markets, the more we produce at home. All else equal, that's a good thing. One of the questions that sometimes gets asked is, are we just shuffling around the deck chairs so we consume it here, but, rather than, exporting it, and is we actually increasing demand and that sort of thing? I think based on the trajectory for renewable fuel policy and those sorts of things, I think this is supported by a lot of new demand. So that also is good. So, yeah, I think all else equal, it's a positive thing for farmers, and I think it's positive momentum for canola, even though it's going to take a little time before these all come online and start, buying from farmers and consuming it here.
Mm-hmm. We'll see how the next few years go with this particular StatsCan report. See if those numbers start to shift at all. All right. Well, this is, before I let you go, I have to, because Leftfield, of course, well known for your pulse analysis. So just quickly, how are the peas? Let's just go with peas, because peas are the most important one, according to me.
Yeah, we saw P acres come down a little bit, maybe not as much as we initially thought. It's just, I think, it's just a little bit of a sluggish market. I think one of the things with peas we have to remember is in export markets, there's a lot of other countries that are also starting to export peas and compete with Canada. China's been a real key market, but they've been buying less, and so not I would say an overly bullish outlook for peas here as we look forward for yellow peas. So we'll see, and certainly again if the acres come in a little higher than as StatsCan reported and as we anticipated, certainly that doesn't help as well. But a lot of weather ahead of us for sure. If the acres end up being a little smaller and if yields do get crimped a little bit, that'll help tighten things up. But maybe not as bullish an outlook as some might want.
We always want.
We always want to be bullish. I know.
We always want to, at least on the crop side. Not so much. I'm talking with Phil Flynn later in the show to talk about energy markets. That's where we don't want bullish. All right.
Yeah, we'll pick and choose. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Jon, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
I always appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. Big thanks to Jon Driedger at Leftfield Commodity Research for joining me on the show today. We're going to take a quick break, and I'll be back with today's product spotlight right after this.
ABJ Agri-Products is North America's exclusive distributor for air bubble jets and easy jets. These sprayer nozzles reduce the number of driftable droplets and at the same time maintain a uniform droplet size, primarily between 300 and 400 micron, ensuring more even dispersion of your chemical products, providing reduced drift and increased plant coverage. Let us help improve your spraying operation by visiting abjagra.com. That's abjagri.com.
As you head out into the field this season, the Corn School's got you covered. Everything from tillage discussions, weed control info, field trial results, yield strategies, and more. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast from your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Want to get the best out of your soybean crops? Whether you've been growing them for a generation or are just starting into soybeans, find what you need to know at soybeanschool.com. You'll see videos on growing tips, pest control, and much more from specialists across the region, all in one place. Easy for you to access from your desktop, tablet, or mobile phone. Maximize your yields by staying up to date with the Soybean School, presented by BASF, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta Canada.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and it is time for today's product spotlight. Joining me on the line is Roger Gunning. He's the sales manager for agriculture North America with U.S. Borax. Roger, welcome here.
Hey, thank you, Lyndsey.
All right. So what's something that growers in North America don't necessarily think about when it comes to their fertilizer?
Yeah, that's really a good question, Lyndsey, because usually the question I get will pertain to the product use or pricing or around availability. So the question growers don't think to ask is around heavy metals in the product they are considering to purchase. And the real fact is there could be heavy metals like arsenic and fertilizers that have not gone through the stringent refining process. These products, unfortunately, can include unrefined borates. So, and while the question is not asked or even thought about much, it is well known that arsenic can be toxic to plants as well as animals.
So why then should a grower care if there is arsenic in the boron product that they're using?
Yeah, well, the reason is, crops will take up arsenic just like they take out fertilizer. So if you have a high level of arsenic in your fertilizer and you don't know it, it will accumulate in the soil and then it'll be taken up in your crops.
Now, we know that crops need borates for healthy growth, for higher yield. So what should farmers do if they are worried that there might be arsenic in the boron fertilizer that they're using?
Really, a farmer should check the source of the product. They should look for refined borates before making their final purchase decision. Refined borates are products that have gone through really an extensive purification process to remove these impurities, including arsenics or really any other heavy metals. So most unrefined borates, unfortunately, such as eulexydes or colamides, they're only washed, dried, and crushed. Whereas refined borates, like those we sell here at U.S. Borax, go through a 7-step process to help ensure at the end our product is pure. And many of our products are also OMRI listed.
Now, okay, what does OMRI stand for?
OMRI stands for the Organic Materials Review Institute.
Okay. I figure if I don't know, somebody else out there may not know as well. So I may as well ask. All right. So this is certainly something that should be on growers' radar. They should. The tagline, of course, that we read here at Real Agriculture is ask for it by name. So this, really drives home that the product is different. There is a difference between these products that are out there. How then can growers get more information if they want to know more about U.S. Borax?
Oh, that's great. Definitely take a look at our website, agriculture.borax.com, or really feel free to give me a phone call, 773-923-7420.
All right, Roger, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Oh, thank you, Lyndsey.
All right, we'll be back with more RealAg Radio right after this.
If farmers know one thing to be true, it's this. There are a lot of factors you can't control. The weather, breakdowns, and a million other variables standing between you and a successful season. But for all the uncertainty, you wouldn't change a thing, because that's farming. And that's why Koch Agronomic Services wants to make life on the farm a bit more predictable. From nutrient management and protection to seed enhancement, get the confidence of being in control. Visit kochagsolutions.com.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. I am your host for the day, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is sponsored by Koch Agronomic Services, makers of Super U nitrogen stabilizer. Protect against all 3 forms of nitrogen loss with this ready-to-use granular fertilizer. Learn more about Super U and other nitrogen management, nutrient protection, and seed enhancement solutions at kochagronomicservices.ca. Joining me now to talk energy markets, I have Phil Flynn, author of The Energy Report. How are you, Phil?
I'm doing great. We've been very busy with the markets today, and busy with our contributions to the world. But yeah, it's been a wild day today, and we're trying to get on top of whether or not we should be focused on supply and demand fundamentals, or we should be worried on earnings and banking concerns.
All right. So here's a question then. I thought we were moving past that, but here we are. We're back in the general sort of what's going on.
I think the market wants to put the banking crisis behind it. I know the energy sector really does, because the banking sector is very important to oil and gas production, usage, you name it. Banks not only lend money to provide the ability for products to be produced, right, and give these guys capital. At the same time, they use the banks for hedging. And so when you get the uncertainty in the banking sector, it really crushes the market as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are still having to talk about the banking crisis. We are not past that. It is creating economic uncertainty. Let's look bigger picture, though, as well. We certainly have things happening on a global scale that are certainly not helping. Let's put it that way. And I think about right now Sudan. So Sudan, not a huge, supplier of oil per se, but certainly what's happening there has an impact on countries around it and relations with the U.S. So what's happening there? How is that impacting these markets?
I think the war in Ukraine reflects a greater upheaval in the global force, right? The global energy order, so to speak, which has really been shaken to its core, over the last couple of years. When you came into President Biden's presidency, right? It was all about canceling the Keystone Pipeline. It was about drilling moratoriums. It was about getting off the fossil fuels. But now what we're finding is that when the United States pulled back from that global, fossil fuel dominance, the rest of the world seemed to fall apart. Whether it be the war in Ukraine, which had a huge energy component to it, right? Russia made sure that Europe was basically dependent on them for energy, and they used that as a weapon against the rest of Europe, and it's a deterrent from them coming down too aggressively on them. But I think if you look at the relationship that we've had with Saudi Arabia that has cooled off dramatically under this administration, new alliances between Saudi Arabia and China, Saudi Arabia and Iran. The latest with Sudan is just another place in the globe where things are becoming unsettled for oil, and ultimately that's very bullish for prices because uncertainty is going to add to the risk premium and keep those prices, on edge, moving towards the upside.
So bullish in this sense, from an agricultural perspective, not great. Diesel is quite expensive, and that to me feels like it's going to stay in that range. Is that what we're looking at least for the short term?
I think so. I think we're in a new higher era for diesel prices. And farmers know all too well the way the prices have gone up over the last 10 to 20 years, right? We've seen a situation where, we went to cleaner burning diesel for a lot of the farmers. That's good for the environment. It was bad for prices. But the war in Ukraine really unmasked how tight the global supply and demand picture is for diesel right now from a refining capacity situation, as well as the quality of oil that you use to create a lot of diesel. And so this year, if you look at diesel prices right now, they're not as bad as they were a year ago, but there's no room for error in the system. The lack of, Russian crude, or the lack of Russian crude, the displacement of Russian crude to places like Russia and India and Japan as opposed to the United States and in Europe has really created a situation that keeps the diesel market on edge, and that's a big problem.
You're right. Displacement is perhaps the best term for that. We talk about that here in Canada on the fertilizer front, of course. So speaking of fertilizer, we can't talk fertilizer without talking natural gas. So we can't talk energy without talking natural gas. We did see, of course, just that roller coaster ride that was last year for natural gas prices. What are they doing now?
If you're going to trade natural gas, you need to wear a seatbelt and a helmet. I mean, come on. I mean, look at the volatility. I mean, we started going into last year, of course, and we really thought, we were in a situation where we weren't going to have enough natural gas, right? We had a situation where we had the war in Ukraine, supplies were cut off, the U.S. had to export a record amount of natural gas, but a few things happened that really changed the dynamic of that market. First of all, you had that major outage of the biggest LNG export terminal here in the United States, Freeport LNG, which went down, which caused the natural gas supplies here in the United States to get backed up, driving down domestic prices. In Europe, of course, prices were going through the roof early in the season because they weren't going to have enough to get through winter because Russia cut off their supplies. The transatlantic pipeline, had some issues. So you had all these issues where we thought we would have short supplies, but Mother Nature basically came in and saved the day. We ended up having one of the warmest winters on record, right? In fact, I think this week, the Department of Energy said that the amount of natural gas that we withdrew from storage was the least amount we have in 7 years. And that really was because if you look at the heating degree days, And those are the days where you have to really turn on the heater and you really burn a lot of natural gas for keeping warm. They were non-existent. So really that saved the prices. It also saved diesel prices to go back to that because of the warm winter. We didn't use as much for heating. So it's amazing how a couple of situations took a natural gas market that looked like it was going to go to $10 or $15 and turns around, and went below $2. So how much can change? But I'm seeing early warning signs right now that maybe the bearishness in the natural gas market is coming to an end. And we're seeing that mainly because we're seeing the export market for LNG heat up again. We're seeing the Freeport export terminal come back online. That should level the playing field. That doesn't mean we're going to go back to $10, but I think our days of natural gas going below $2 is probably over as well.
Mm-hmm. So here you are, back to supply and demand. So I'm so excited because it means that it still matters, right?
It does. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what drives us. During the war, before we get to that point, there are definitely outside factors that have been influencing prices. Whether it's the perception that we're going into a recession or fears that the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates to the sky, impacts prices because it immediately impacts the interest rates, right? It impacts the value of the dollar. And when you have an oil can that's traded in dollars, if the dollar is strong, that price is going to be cheaper. But I don't think I've ever seen so much disconnect from the really real supply and demand fundamentals versus, the perceived supply and demand fundamentals. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at the numbers, supply versus demand, we're going to see the tightest energy market that we've seen probably in 20 years, right? But if you're on the fear side and you look at the possibility of a recession and the possibility of what may happen down the road, it's telling you a different story. So that's why I basically spend every day ripping my hair out, right? Because of the crazy volatility that we've seen in the market. So.
I feel like that is very warranted, Phil. It has the past, let's say, 18 months to 2 years. Well, actually, okay, we'll go 3, has been pretty volatile. So you did mention, though, and so maybe we'll end on that, on supply demand on the inventory side. So where are we at with U.S. oil inventory? In light of, we are headed into, the travel season, let's say the summer season. Hopefully people are going to be traveling more than they were. That's going to increase demand. Where are we at on the inventory side, coming into the summer?
I think we're tighter than we should be, right? Mm. And, it's kind of funny. Every week, we get data from the Energy Information Administration. We get the supply status report, and you get that 4-week moving average, and you say, supplies of crude oil are, 8% above the 5-year average. And every time I see that number, I have to caution people is don't get comfortable with that. Because the only reason why supplies are above average for crude oil, and actually I think they're closer to 2% above average, is because we released a record amount of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. If we hadn't done that, the supplies of crude oil would be probably 10 to 20% below average for this time of year. And the funny thing is with that Band-Aid that we released, it makes the inventories look good and brings us a little calm, but underneath that, you look out a little bit, and the market's not prepared for what may happen when that oil stops being released, and that day is coming. So, think of this. We released a record amount of oil from the reserve, over 220 million barrels of oil released, and the prices of oil are still struggling. The supplies are still struggling to get above average. And so really we're below average for crude supplies. That means there's not a lot of room for error. If we do lose some supply source, that's going to mean sharply higher prices for crude oil. And products were not much better, right? I think for distillate fuels, we're close to 11% below the 5-year average. Gasoline supplies are below the 5-year average. So we've got a situation where, that we're running on, a very tight bank account, and there's not a lot of room for error. And if something gets messed up, you're definitely going to see a situation where prices could spike, and they could spike hard this summer.
Well, Phil, this has been fun, but I wish it was better news for those of us who have to fill diesel tanks.
Well, I'm sorry. That's what I hate. Sometimes you have to be the bearer of bad news.
Well,
but, the good news is at least prices are stable right now. So enjoy it while you can. Lock in those prices, before things change.
That's right. It's all about risk management. All right. Okay, Phil. Of course, the Energy Report. Where can people find you if they would like to follow along with your insights?
Yeah, they can sign up. The report is free, no cost or obligation. You just email me at pflynn@pricegroup.com. We'll get you set up for it, and you can call me at 888-264-5665, and you should be able to catch me on the Fox Business Network. We talk oil almost every week or a couple times a week, so tune in and catch me there as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Phil. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be back with the rest of the show right after this. Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Sean Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Well, it is true. Time flies when you're having fun. And here we are, the final segment of today's RealAg Radio. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is brought to you by Invita. The answer to low supply and high prices for nitrogen is Invita. A microbe with systemic nitrogen fixation, Invita works throughout the foliage and roots, providing a right place, right time source of nitrogen to maximize yield in corn, wheat, soybeans, and potatoes. Book your Invita while supplies last. Okay, as promised, we're going to go to a short but very important discussion with Rob Miller of BASF and Bernard Tobin of RealAgriculture, of course, where we're going to talk about the fact that we had a very open late fall and a mild winter in many areas of southern Ontario, and what impact that's having on the weed population and weed pressure this spring before the soybeans go in.
Bernard Tobin here on the Soybean School. Today I'm at the Maryhill Research Farm, the BASF Research Farm, with Rob Miller. Rob, how's it going?
Great. How you doing, Bern?
I'm pretty good. Now, we're cold today. We both had to sort of get on our woolies, shall we say. Last week we were in shorts. I mean, last fall, open fall, a warm winter. Boy, what's the weeds situation looking like here?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the weeds definitely woke up with the, like you said, the open fall, warmer than normal winter. We never really had winter here in Ontario, at least the snow cover, until, March. And that's where, we're getting a lot of questions on weed control, especially on cover crops that didn't die, that you would expect would die over that winter. But since they had some nice snow cover, it was warmer than normal, we're starting to see a lot of that regrowth here as well. So things like oats is probably the main one, but this field behind me is actually winter wheat, volunteer winter wheat. And this actually had 2 passes of a disc, and one fall burn down application. You can see the amount of volunteer wheat that we're dealing with this year as well. So it's just not cover crops that overwintered. It's just, a lot of those winter annuals and perennials. We're getting a lot of those ones because they have been growing for the last couple of years.
Now,
couple weeks.
I'm seeing a lot of chickweed here. What's that tell you?
Yeah, chickweed is always that good indicator weed species, and it's actually starting to flower now in some spots. And if the chickweed's flowering, and it tends to germinate throughout that winter. We saw it at Christmas time. We saw it, in early March before we had some of that snow cover. And that's where, if the chickweed is flowering, that means a lot of the other winter annuals and perennials are still growing. So they're not necessarily growing vegetatively, but they're definitely putting down some larger roots. So things like the fleabane, the dandelion especially. We're seeing some pretty large dandelions. Don't look that big from the on top of the soil surface, but they're starting to get a really large, thick root on them, and that's going to be difficult to control.
Yeah. Another weed that you talked about that probably is going to be on your radar screen as well, it's bluegrass.
Yeah, bluegrass, especially on some of those heavier clays, but even driving around parts of southwestern Ontario, seeing a lot more of the annual bluegrass, and the rough stalk bluegrass tends to be more in the Guelph area north. So there's two main types of bluegrass species that we have here in Ontario, the annual bluegrass, the rough stalk bluegrass, but the annual bluegrass tends to grow in a lot of clumps. And after talking at a lot of our winter meetings this year, a lot of growers are coming up and asking about, how do we control that bluegrass? Because you just spray it with glyphosate, the next day it starts to germinate. And since it does grow in these clumps, it's really tough to do any sort of tillage because it comes up lumpy seed bed, and there's not really too many products out there outside of some soil applied group 15s like Zidua SC that will have some form of activity on it. So it germinates in the fall as well as on the spring. It tends to be more of an issue on some of those heavier clays, but we're starting to see it move in across the province to other areas as well.
Hey, we always like to talk about, we unfortunately talk about resistance and weed resistance. Conversations this week, and you've heard them over the winter, about group 14 resistance ragweeds, a real issue for IP soybean growers.
Yeah, definitely. So we have common ragweed here that's now resistant, confirmed with the University of Guelph, Francois Tardif, to group 14 herbicides. We also have populations that are resistant to glyphosate, group 2, as well as the triazine, group 5s. So that's where, especially if you're growing IP soybeans, that's going to be a major challenge. So the main thing with dealing with some of these resistant weed species is that, control them and out of the crops if you are growing IP soybeans or dry beans there as well. So have a really good solid foundation in your corn crop, making sure that you control some of those ragweed seeds after the wheat has been harvested, avoiding it from going to seed, and also starting to use that herbicide layering approach. So having some residual down at planting, controlling it early, aggressive scouting before it gets too big, having some residual down in crop to try to get you through the end of the season.
Now, Rob, you mentioned the importance of aggressive scouting. You talked also about cover crops, some of those things that didn't die. How important now is it to get those soil applied herbicides down and working?
Definitely, especially since these weeds are getting a lot larger, and something like the cover crop oats, and volunteer wheat, it's pretty sensitive to glyphosate, but you want to make sure that you use the proper rates based on what's in the field. So, glyphosate at this time of year in these conditions is very slow. You're looking at least 2 weeks, and you want to control those that cover crop at least 2 weeks before you can plant your corn or your soybean crop. So it's going to be slow, but if you're using lower rates based on controlling volunteer wheat, you're giving up some activity on some of those larger perennial weeds. So select the rate that's required based on the field, and then add in that second additional mode of action. That's very important, and getting it on early, especially prior to the fleabane bolting, prior to the dandelion flowering, before those weeds get too big. You want to apply to more actively growing weeds, and that's where you get much better weed control. So it's actually better to spray it on more of a warming trend. Right. You get much faster on the tail end, much faster, more consistent weed control in terms of, instead of trying to apply some of these products in this type of weather.
Right. What about tillage? Should we still have some room to fit that in?
Yes, definitely. So if you're doing any tillage, a field like this, you want to try and get on here and spray prior to do any type of tillage, especially if you're doing any of the the high-speed disc. That's not really a good form of weed control. It's more for seed bed preparation. But when you have a lot of corn stalks or something like that you kind of chop up, they sometimes cover up those weeds and actually make them much harder to kill. And these perennial weeds that have some larger roots, we want to make sure that we get that product on them very early before they get too big.
Hey, final point, and that is, you mentioned it before we came on the camera here, and that is about, grow a good crop. Make good decisions, get that canopy closed. That could be some of the most effective weed control you can do.
Absolutely. So, it's just not about chemical control. You got to look at that integrated weed management approach. So, getting that crop off to the best start possible, crop canopy is your best form of weed control, shading out those weeds. So that's looking at, your row spacing, but even just growing in good or planting in good ideal conditions, getting that crop out of the ground, uniform emergence, and also utilizing cover crops as well, whether it's interseeding or after the wheat comes off, controlling that different times of the year, and also good crop rotation as well. That's very important as well.
Great stuff, Rob. Always good to have you on the Soybean School. We'll be planting before long, and we'll be back in the field later in the summer. How about that?
Yep, thanks for having me.
All right, so big thanks to Bern and to Rob for that report. As promised, we're going to get to some of the news. So if you listened to yesterday's show, you did hear from Remy Gosselin with the Canadian Grain Commission to talk about what the contingency plan was to keep grain moving during the PSAC strike. So the federal strike, this includes Treasury Board as well as CRA, is ongoing as of recording this news segment today. And it is impacting several different aspects of government, but one of the ones that is not impacted, we have heard, is the cash advance program. So the cash advance program is put out by 30 different groups on behalf of the federal government. They are not subject to the strike, so that is good news. However, for some of the other programs, of course, there may be delays. So agri-stability is one of them. So that could cause some delays. And of course, there's several other things like if you need a passport, if you're waiting for grant money from different departments. And we're still digging into, and this is actually something we may have on tomorrow's radio show, we are hoping to line up a discussion with Agriculture Minister Marie-Claude Bibeau to talk about whether or not any of the research trials or other trials are being put in right now at the research stations across Canada. Because, of course, that is a question. If all of the technicians are on strike, what gets in the ground if this strike continues much longer? Now, we are hopeful that the strike should end soon, but it seems to have gone on longer than anyone thought already. So the future is rather uncertain as to whether or not we're going to continue this in the long term. Now, as you may have heard on Friday's radio show, the union does, of course, have a strike bank account, basically, where they put in funds during the years, and then when there is a strike, striking members can draw from that account for their strike pay, which is, I think, $75 if they show up at the picket line for 4 hours. So that money will only last, it's estimated, about 7 days. And so we are approaching that 7-day mark. So it does beg the question, if the money runs out, how many people are going to be actively picketing? How many people are going to be waiting on this, or will they start to put the pressure on to get a deal made? So let's hope that this all does get wrapped up quick. The income tax deadline has not been extended. So I think it's usually April 30th, but because it's a Sunday, it's May 1st this year. Everyone is being told you're still supposed to, of course, be filing your income tax, but there are no CRA employees for the most part. They're actually processing anything, nor is there anyone on the helpline to ask questions. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, other things of note this week, the Canola Council of Canada is looking for a new president and CEO as Jim Everson, who's been in the seat since I want to say 2017. Oh, goodness, I better check. But anyway, he's been there a couple of years. Jim Everson has announced he is leaving, but he is going to stay on until they find a new president and CEOs. Ontario also announced that it will be spending $13.5 million in a new poultry research centre at Elora. So this is a joint project through the Government of Ontario and the Agriculture Research Institute of Ontario, plus the poultry industry boards. They've all signed a memorandum of understanding to invest in this Ontario Poultry Research Centre to advance research there at Elora. What else have we got going on? We've had Syngenta announce that this is Syngenta Global, has announced that they are teaming up with a biological company that has a particular platform that works with proteins to create bioinsecticides. So we may see in the next few years some new actives that are actually biologically based coming out of that platform. So that is pretty interesting, and we'll be looking at what's going to happen there. But I do just want to mention that is, of course, Syngenta Crop Protection based in Switzerland. And so this is, the larger scale that's happening here. So one of the last things I wanted to just touch on quickly is if you haven't been to realagriculture.com recently, we did put up our new poll. And If you heard the Farmer Rapid Fire a few weeks ago, Sean Haney asked, if you could grow any crop, which crop would you grow? And we thought that would make an excellent poll question. And we've got some great answers already. And so if you would like to participate in the poll, it is there. We asked the same question, but we frame it in such a way that if you knew you could be profitable, because of course people try things all the time, don't they? There's always the risk. So imagine if the risk was off the table and answer this question. So if you knew you could be profitable doing it, what would you grow? With that, I think we've wrapped up today's show. And look at me, I did some news. Okay, so if you have any feedback on the markets, on the StatsCan survey going out in December, remember StatsCan said they wanted to be nicer to farmers and sort of balance off the ask. Has that rendered it less relevant? Would love to know your thoughts. Give the feedback line a call, 1-855-776-6147, or you can find us on social media at Real Agriculture. I have been your host, Lyndsey Smith. I will be back tomorrow with the Farmer Rapid Fire. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you for downloading this episode of RealAg Radio, brought to you by high-performing new carbine insecticide from FMC. New carbine insecticide hits aphids hard with effective, selective, and extended control. It also has activity on ligas and tarnished plant bugs. Ask your retailer today.